we have found over the last 3 years of our survey on economic well-being that 70% of adults today, parents, do not believe their children will have the same level or quality of lifestyle in California. The main issue for all Californians have been affordability, cost of living. That's been the top concern for years on our statewide survey.
That's today's guest on SideBar, Tani Cantil-Sakauye, President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California.
SideBar is brought to you by Monterey College of Law, San Luis Obispo College of Law, Kern County College of Law, and Empire College of Law, located in Santa Rosa.
Welcome to SideBar, featuring conversations about optimism in action with lawyers and leaders inspiring change. And now your co-hosts, Jackie Gardina and Mitch Winnick.
Mitch, very excited to be in what I think those of us in the legal profession think about as legal royalty today, because we are able to speak to Tani Cantil-Sakauye, who at the time we were both deans, was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of California, but is currently the President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California, where she holds the Walter and Esther Hewlett Chair in Understanding California's Future. It is going to be so helpful to hear about how states are managing what I think is a very tumultuous time and making the best of a situation at a time when it is difficult to know what the federal government is going to do and how it's going to affect the state's ability to respond. Very excited to hear and hopefully get some of that optimism and action we've been trying to put forth.
And Jackie, I'm particularly pleased to have Justice Tani, as she's now said we can call her, which will be difficult for us as law deans to not call her chief, but we'll try to remember that it's Tani. The Public Policy Institute of California is doing such an amazing job of tackling this enormous breadth of topics that we all know are out there, from education to healthcare to immigration to police reform. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So I'm looking forward to hear both how the Institute selects its topics, how you try to keep your arm around all of those things, and the response of what you're getting when you put these really meaningful and research-based reports out on these important topics. Welcome to SideBar today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to see both of you and to have a conversation.
Tani, what we usually like to do, and again, it was really awkward to say Tani, but what we usually like to do is just allow our listeners to get to know a little bit more about the person who's here to talk with us. Can you tell us about your pathway into law and then how you became the CEO of the Public Policy Institute?
Thank you, Jackie. My parents had little to no education. My father, second grade, and my mother, community college. At the time, she was 50. So I'm a product of primarily public school and community college. I was a transfer student before transfer became a thing to UC Davis ultimately, and graduated and entered law school 1 year later at UC Davis Law. Like many students who have no real idea of a professional future because you don't know one, I sort of learned by doing and ended up finding my path first at the district attorney's office in Sacramento County. And I was hired at the time because one of their promised positions failed to materialize because that person hadn't passed the bar. So I was hired as a probationary employee and ended up staying on for about 4 years. I think my greatest break in life was the fact that I started in Sacramento, which is not really where I intended to start professionally, but it allowed me then to apply in person for an interview in the governor's office in his legal department. And at the time, Governor George Deukmejian had one main lawyer who was looking for a second, basically. And so they were looking for someone with trial experience. That happened to be me. And I was fortunate to be hired into the last few years of the Deukmejian administration in California. And thereafter, when his term ended, when no term limits, but he wasn't seeking a third term. He looked to place people in his inner circle. And they asked me where I wanted to go. And I said, municipal court or the attorney general's office. And in those days, A, there was a municipal court, and B, it only required 6.5 years or 6 years of experience. And I had a 6.5. So I went to the court and started doing basically referee work, traffic, night traffic, probation at court, and worked there for 14 years until I was selected by Arnold Schwarzenegger to be on the Court of Appeal for 6 years. And then Arnold Schwarzenegger, our governor at the time, named me to the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice position. I ran for statewide office and stayed there for a full term, 12 years, making 32 years on the bench.
Wow. What a career. That's a great story.
And just so people understand who don't live in California, you were appointed by the governor, but then eventually had to run for election in your position on the bench.
Correct. And that's true for all 3 levels of judge in California. The Chief Justice position, unlike other states, is a separate position where the person has to run for that position and title and carries it for 12 years if elected.
How did you make the transition to Public Policy Institute of California? That's not just inherently a natural leap.
No, you're right, Mitch. It wasn't natural for me either. But what happened, it was a confluence of factors. I was finishing my term as chief. And mind you, I started my term as Chief Justice during the Great Recession, had to make a lot of cuts and close courtrooms and lay people off. And then I ended my term primarily with taking the court, the judiciary, through COVID, signing 900 emergency orders, working with the governor, closing courts down, stopping trials. And then it was next for me to actually file again to run for another 12. A retention election in California, I only run against myself. There's no one who can run or bid against me. And typically those are successful in California. However, at the same time I was considering the bid to do a second term, another 12 years as chief, I was well above retirement age in California for the judiciary. That's 60. I was beyond 60. I was 63. And I was beginning to think about the future of the branch and who should take it into the next 12. Because I think if you commit to running, you should stay 12. And so at that point, I began to think about what my options were. And then at that point, the CEO president position of the Public Policy Institute of California came across my desk. I had worked with PPIC in the past, done several interviews with them, read their material. And so they reached out to me about this position as president and CEO, and I was torn. I thought I'd leave the bench entirely, not work as a lawyer, not work in the legal field. But ultimately, on faith, I made the leap, and I think I'm so much more at peace with it, and it was the right move for me at the time.
Well, I remember listening to you speak one time as Chief Justice, and you were talking about how your role in the Chief Justice position actually had a lot of policy in it. We think of judges as sitting on the bench, hearing cases and issuing rulings, but you were actually navigating the legislature and doing an enormous amount of policy work as the Chief Justice.
You're absolutely right, Jackie. I was not aware of that particular arm of the responsibility as the Chief Justice of California, but as head of the judicial branch, thinking about changes and guarding against negative change and trying to bring home a budget every year and going into the legislature and being responsive to their constituents' criticisms of the court really meant I spent a lot of time working on policy with the Judicial Council. And that's where I became increasingly more interested in how policy was being made in our state.
Before we get into policy issues with the Public Policy Institute, I have to ask, for many of us, we're looking at what the judiciary is doing, particularly on the national level, and particularly at the Supreme Court of the United States, where I grew up professionally. I thought of them as, to some extent, an impartial arbiter of issues and policies, as you've said. But I've lost faith in that description. You've sat in the main seat having to negotiate, talking about policy from the bench. Well, we now have a Supreme Court that appears to be creating policy from the bench, my own personal opinion. Can you just give us some insight of what does it seem like when you're on the other side of that bench being asked to do those things?
Thank you. That's a truly critical question to ask ourselves now, and I think it does bear a step back and context. The United States Supreme Court, as its own third branch of government at the highest level, was created to be, as all state courts and all judicial branches are, a check on the balance of power of the three branches. And at the same time, it takes the cases, and times change. And as much as we had Plessy versus Ferguson, where separate but equal was upheld. And then 50 some years later, we have Brown versus Board of Education, which completely reverses that precedent. We have that kind of movement at the United States Supreme Court, maybe now more than ever. But we also know that the United States Supreme Court has gone through areas of jurisdictional change. The 60s, we saw, for example, at the United States Supreme Court level, an incredible change in the treatment of criminal defendants' rights. We saw an expansion of the Fourth, the Fifth, the Sixth, the Eighth Amendments. And so the courts go through these kinds of growths. So it depends, of course, on the lens in which the members of the court see the issues, but also point out that the United States Supreme Court is unlike, I would say, any high state court. It is a policy body. It's a lifetime appointment of 9 people. And sometimes I tell my friends who watch what's happening at the High Court and Congress and in the president's office, I say, well, the president is one person with the executive branch at his beck and call. Congress is hundreds and hundreds of people with senators and House members and hundreds of people. And then you have 9 people and you only need a majority. So it's not surprising, really, just from a practical standpoint, that the United States Supreme Court is more flexible, fluid than the other 2 branches of government. And so it's a time where people are paying attention to the court. And the court is, for the most part, on non-controversial, less high-profile issues. They are, like any court, relatively uniformly unanimous or close to it. But they have, as you point out, in the last several years, last 5 years, I would even say, truly kinds of precedent-setting cases that have made America pay attention to the judiciary.
I want to stay on the court for a minute, but actually how the changing or shifts in federal law and federal constitutional law are putting pressure on the state courts and the state constitutions to continue to protect, perhaps in places where the federal constitution is being pulled back in terms of rights and civil liberties. I'm wondering if that is difficult for state courts to manage when the pressure turns to the state courts to start to interpret the state constitutions to encompass rights that have been lost at the federal level?
I think that's really astute observation. I know at the California Supreme Court, we were always cognizant, first and foremost, of the California Constitution and what we could decide in our realm without risking or causing any federal review if we stayed within the confines of our own law and our own Constitution. There is an interpretation tool that speaks to avoidance of constitutional issues if you can, because it can cabin the appeal or the future of that rule of law. So we've always been, and I think it's becoming more and more poignant, that states and high courts within states are looking to their own state constitution because, as you point out, state constitutions can be far more protective and expansive of rights than the federal constitution. The federal constitution is a floor. And thereafter, each state, based on how they amend their constitution, are able to impose greater restrictions on law enforcement and greater personal and private freedoms for its residents.
Jackie, I want to take a moment to reflect that as we're talking about optimism in action, many of our guests say that they first started thinking about a career in public service while they were still in law school. And schools like yours and mine, Monterey College of Law, provide an affordable, convenient way for working adults to attend law school and pursue these interests. Classes are taught by practicing lawyers and judges who prepare our students to serve their community in many of the same areas that we are discussing here on SideBar. For more information, go to montereylaw.edu. Let's move now to the Public Policy Institute. We could talk about the courts and the balance of power for the rest of the day. Obviously, Jackie and I find that fascinating, and I know you do as well. Many times California is looked at as a bellwether of so many policies because of our size, the impact of our economy, the impact of the businesses we have, high tech, biotech, the new electrical grid type issues. California gets a disproportionate amount of attention. The Policy Institute appears to step right into that and go right down the menu of those items. How do you do that, and how do you pick?
The Public Policy Institute of California is one of the few nonprofits in California that's 30 years young, or actually more like 31, 32 years. We've been around for a long time, and I think part of our appeal and strength has been the fact that we are nonpartisan and we are independent, meaning we do pick. We pick what we are going to write. We pick what we are going to research. And when we obtain data or receive grants or project funding for different reports, we make it very clear that we are independent and there is no editing overview by anyone who provides funds or anyone who's looking for a result-oriented report. We've been successful at this, and we study approximately 8 areas of California policy because there's so much to study in California. So we study water policy, economic policy, we study criminal justice, we study the safety net, which are the programs like Medi-Cal and tax credits and food credits for vulnerable families. We study TK through 12 education. We study all what we call higher education in California, community colleges and CSUs and UCs in California. We also study our Californians. We do 8 independent surveys statewide on government, on the environment, on elections, and we do all of this in a way that is data oriented. If we don't have the data, we can't write to it. So we're constantly in negotiations with entities for their data. And we're also what I call a research think tank plus, because I run the Understanding California's Future team. And what we do is we do a lot of public convenings. We bring hundreds of people together multiple times during the year, and we talk about a topic that's important to California. We bring in the experts to talk about it. We pay for everyone's lunch. We rent out a conference room in a hotel. We bring online audiences in. For example, we've had Leon Panetta talking about the Israeli bombing in October. We also brought in Jerry Brown, who talked about his view of California. We bring in new legislators, rural legislators, to talk about different issues facing their regions of California. And then we write to it. We blog. We do several videos. We do a civics program for high school through community college. And I'll just give you an example. We don't study energy, powering California, fossil fuels and renewable resources. But come August 21st in Sacramento, we're hosting a day-long event, bringing in Chevron's president, bringing in PG&E, bringing in the California electrical folks, bringing in manufacturers, bringing in industry, bringing in consumers, utilities, to talk about where does California stand with all of these goals about carbon emissions. We don't study energy, but in the piece called Understanding California's Future, which I direct, we look at the trends in California and should we be paying attention, the aging population, housing trends, election trends, because we think the trends, while not going to tell the future, they give us projections about the future.
So what do you see are some of the biggest issues or trends?
Oh, the biggest trends in California to me are truly, I'll just start with the fact that we have an aging population that's going to age faster than any other state. And so we're going to lose this wide swath of a boomer generation. The boomer generation is known primarily for having the most people with 4-year degrees. And that's a huge brain loss for California. That affects our labor force. And our labor force is going to be tasked with paying for all of our public programs, our public education, our public pensions. And so we need to upscale our labor force. We need to educate our labor force. We do a lot, for example, with higher education for people who wish to get a 4-year degree. We write a lot about the funding and the pathways. We don't think it's for everyone, but for people who do seek one, we think it's imperative that they have a clear, debt-free way to get there. And we also know that having a 4-year degree is the single greatest tool for economic mobility in California, bar none. And we continue to chart pay scales and compensation of people with degrees and people without degrees. And in that charting, for example, one of our biggest challenges in California is that we're losing a population of people. We're losing males, primarily Black and Latino, between 18 and 34. We're unable to find them or track them in the education system or in the economy, in the workforce. We're worried about what this imbalance means to California's ability to innovate and for California as an employer. We're also looking at energy. We're looking at our demands, and we're looking at the energy transition plan, and that while we all agree with the carbon-free atmosphere and climate change, we need a plan that actually works, where we are able to have lower utility bills, where we can purchase homes, we have good jobs, and our cost of living isn't stratospheric as it is now. We also look at a little bit in housing, and we talk about the fact that we are, as everyone knows, decades and decades behind any building schedule. So we'll be doing some work on the CEQA changes, but mostly we want to know how soon, how fast, when can you build? When will these changes really start to motivate builders and developers? We study water. California is an agricultural king, and we know that with changes in the legislature, for example, to protect groundwater, we are working with the Central Valley, and we know that at least 500,000 acres of agriculture will need to come out of production and be fallowed in order to build our water reserve in groundwater. But we also know that means we're going to lose generations of farmers. Towns could potentially dry up. Educational opportunities in the Central Valley, which are already very challenging, are going to be worse. So the collateral impact of that big change in California is going to affect lives and maybe even affect outmigration and losing population in California.
You can't study those things in silos because they're all interrelated. I'm in Ventura County. We've had enormous, challenging ICE raids at agricultural fields. Immigrant population is incredibly frightened. You're talking about a need for labor. You're talking about a need for education. You're talking about a need for population. And I'm just wondering how what's happening at the immigration level, at the federal level, is going to affect the work that you're doing here in California.
No, again, a great question. And of course, it is absolutely on our minds. There was a time when PPIC studied immigration, and then about 15 years it transitioned to other areas. But immigration pays, in California, it's essential to our well-being. It's not only essential to our agricultural demands, it's also really important in our care communities, in child care, in teachers, in elder care that's becoming more and more demanding, frankly, across the board for all disciplines of education and jobs in labor. We in California rely on the immigrant workforce who's been incredibly, I want to say, just really giving to our community, part of our community. Our surveys at PPIC constantly and regularly show California's support for immigration is over the top because of our appreciation, respect, and understanding of how important they are to our state in many, many ways.
When I went through your website and started reading the summaries of so many of these topics, and then personally get drawn in to get down into the weeds in a number of them, I see how valuable this is. But what we've heard from many of our guests is it is increasingly difficult to get the public and or the younger population among our public to stop, look, listen, read these reports, consider how that's going to be integrated into their future, and then to engage in it. What about the broader population? Where do we go with all this information?
That is so true. So we primarily aim our work at the legislature and the constitutional officers and local government, where we can be of assistance to cities and counties and water districts, et cetera. Because we are, as you point out, we're reports, we are videos, We are quick digests of fact sheets and explainers. We take our reports and really try to boil them down to digestible pieces that can draw people's interest. So we work quite a bit with the legislative members and committees that are in our areas of study. And we work back and forth, and we invite the legislature to some of our lunches. We have private roundtables with them and our researchers talking about what they need and where should we go and what are they looking for and who can we hand them off to if they need some more information to better improve the legislation they're working on. But in terms of trying to get young people, since I've been at PPIC, we've started what we've called the Cal Civics program, aimed at high school and community college, where we invite them and pay for them to come to all of our events. And we feed them breakfast, and they get a little lecture from me and one of our researchers, and we do a poll, and we show them how their views compare to all of California. And then we bring them to our events and we ensure they're engaged, because when we had Governor Brown, we said, okay, you high school students, you're going to get the first question to ask the governor during the Q&A. And they prepare for it. We've brought them to our water policy conference day and talked to them about your future with water in California is really collateral to all of these other issues. You should know this. And so we bring them also for a day of deliberation. Round tables, a researcher sits with each of them and asks them about their interests. And we talk about the policy import of something like that. We do a kind of a career day. We bring some of our younger researchers and say, explain how you got here and why you're here. We're also bringing them to our energy conference, and we're working with a little bit with Stanford because they have a program called Deliberative Democracy, bringing students in, giving them information, having them talk through it, and then pairing them with a group that has a contrary point of view in the same room and talking it through. So we are in the process of just trying to bring in young people. We have a few young people for interns this year. We're trying to find a way to partner and expand like we have with the California State Library. We're working with different organizations to not duplicate, but try to support and broaden what they're doing as well.
I find that very encouraging because I do believe that's going to be one of the most critical challenges that we have. Secondarily, though, I can speak from my own family's experience. I have children who are 29 and 33. I think I got those numbers right. But they both got their graduate degrees and went out of state, would love to come back and live in California, and both of them would tell you there's no scenario in which they could afford a house or have the type of lifestyle that they would envision that they can do elsewhere. Do you also fear that there's a brain drain in California of that next generation of professionals who say, I can take my intelligence and do this from a place where I can actually own a home, raise my children, and have an upwardly mobile career?
You put your finger on it. About 2 years ago, PPIC was the first to report in our statewide survey that for the first time, this out-immigration from California included people with degrees and with a higher level of wealth. We often had seen out-migration being of lower economic earnings. But for the first time, we reported that, and it received an incredible amount of attention and concern from the business community. We have found over the last 3 years of our survey on economic well-being that 70% of adults today, parents, do not believe their children will have the same level or quality of lifestyle in California. So we are well aware and worried about this outmigration. What's interesting is that some of our outmigration has been balanced by immigration into California of young people with degrees. We thought there would be a continuous outflow. What we're seeing is, on balance, young people with degrees are coming into California. But to your point, Mitch, will they stay once they seek a little bit more stability? Or will they leave and take those bigger paychecks and that greater experience out to another state? That's a serious problem for California. The main issue for all Californians over the 5 years of our surveys have been affordability, cost of living. That's been the top concern for years on our statewide survey. And that was one of the reasons we created the Economic Policy Center, was to talk about labor and business together, and opportunities and also shortcomings in California.
Do you have a story about a success that the Policy Institute have seen from taking their reports and the data and influencing either at the local or the state level and seeing positive change occur as a result?
Yes, I think one that comes to mind for me because it's close to my heart has to do with community college and high school. There was in my time, and even just up to a few years ago, if a person from high school graduated and went on to a community college, the community college conducted sort of a pre-screening to determine that student's math and English skills, reading and writing skills. And then the community colleges would universally, depending on the test score, would put a student who fell below the expected scores into what was called remedial math and remedial English reading and writing before the student could take transfer level courses to get to a 4-year university. And we found in our studies over time that a lot of students were stalling out. They weren't finishing. They were getting a lot of credits. They were getting credits in other areas, but they were stalling out and not transferring and then going into the labor market or disappearing. And so our concern was, were these remedial classes in some way a barrier to students staying in and keeping enthusiastic and involved? We did a number of studies and data. We brought it to the legislature to show this loss of student over this. Could it be this remedial classwork? Can we find another way to provide the same kind of assistance without it being classwork that sets them back and doesn't let them take these transfer level classes? And we were able, through legislation, to eliminate that remedial barrier, and that the community colleges put in a different kind of system to help those students, to allow them to take the transfer level course in math or English, reading and writing, but to provide them the assistance concurrently with the class in order that they aren't slowed down or discouraged by taking a year or two of remedial courses before they could be in position to transfer.
That's a great story and really encouraging. Tell us, as we wrap up here, what can we do to be more engaged with the Policy Institute? To our listeners who go, this is fascinating, we can go to your website and there's an enormous amount of valuable information. But as far as personal engagement, what would you invite people to do?
I would invite people, all of our events are free. And I'll just give an example. They're primarily in Sacramento, but we do things also in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And what we do is we put on our website, sign up. Just last month, we had a Building Civic Power. We had the Sheraton, and we had people, about 250 people, 300 people sign up, and we do a free plated lunch during our 1 hour. And we had the Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber. We had Administrative Presiding Justice Judith McConnell, who is part of the Chief Justice's Power of Democracy Civics Initiative. We had Assembly Member Jeff Gonzalez from the Southern California, San Bernardino area. And also we had our survey director, Mark Baldessari, talk about civics. We had 30 community college students. And if you can't make the lunch, tune in to us. It's live. And you can also interact by sending a question to ask any of the panelists. And all of that is free. We do videos. We do quick 30-second TikTok explainers about water in California or the status of housing in California. We put one of our researchers up against a white wall with a tiny microphone, and he or she will go and hit the highlights. We do a lot of fact sheets and explainers. If you're giving speeches and any of these areas fit into your audience, it's a great place to get facts, and it's a great place to see. We're working on a civics video, so that should be done hopefully soon. We contracted with the firm, we're writing a script, and it's going to be a quick, just a primer on civics in California, government in California.
To encourage everyone to do that, that's ppic.org. Is that correct?
Yes.
ppic.org to do all of those things. Sign up for events, read your reports, and participate in these activities. Tani, thank you very much, both for what you're doing with the Institute and for the enthusiasm and forward thinking that you bring to this entire discussion.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Mitch. It's a pleasure to see you again, and I'm glad to see you are still leading in this area and others. Thank you so much.
Mitch, as we've talked to different people in this season about optimism and action, one of the things that we've really learned is that it's really important not to view things in silos, to really have a breadth of understanding about how different policy issues intersect to affect communities. And that's what was so impressive to me about the work that Tani and the Public Policy Institute of California do, because they cover everything from the effect of wildfires and water resources to K through 12 and immigration issues, energy issues. It's just a holistic look at all of the things that affect California communities rather than focusing on one. As we've learned this season, that's really the best way to move forward.
Jackie, this is the second episode in a row in which civic engagement and education have been the focus. And I find that very encouraging.
And on that point, Mitch, it seems fitting that the position that she holds, that Tani holds at PPI, is the chair in understanding California's future, because it seems from what she's saying that she understands that a big part of California's future, and I would really say the United States in general, is that engagement, that civic engagement, especially among the younger population. Once again, I want to thank everyone who joined us today on SideBar. And as always, Mitch and I would love to know what's on your mind. You can reach us at sidebarmedia.org.
SideBar would not be possible without our producer David Eakin, who composes and plays all of the music you hear on SideBar. Thank you also to Dina Dowsett, who creates and coordinates SideBar's social media marketing.